I'd like to thank you for watching my lecture today. My name is Spencer Rainey, and I chose to lecture on African American soldiers during the American Civil War. This lecture is designed for a lower level graduate class on the American Civil War. African American soldiers. Over the past few weeks, we've been discussing the American Civil War with a look at some of the key battles and Army leaders. For the next 2 weeks, I would like for us to turn our focus to a group of people, African Americans. Now, at this time, there are enslaved and free African Americans in both the North and the South. In this week's lecture, I'm going to focus on those involved in the war, and then next week, we'll discuss those who were not directly involved. The goal of this lecture is to understand the role of African Americans in the Union Army, the hardships they encountered, but also to discuss the role of African Americans in the Confederate Army and to debate the truth or myth behind Black Confederate soldiers. Let's start with the Union Army. April 12, 1861, the Battle of Fort Sumter in South Carolina was the start of the Civil War, which we've already discussed, but did not just ignite the Civil War, but also initiated a need to fight within the African American community, both Northern and Southern alike. Many realized from this battle the significance of what was about to take place, and many African American men chose to take up arms with the Union Army. Now, these were currently free African American men. They had already been freed in the North or escaped slavery in the South. Regardless of their past, these men volunteered to fight for the Union Army and were considered free men by the government. At the initial start of the war, the Union did not accept African American soldiers. They were very uncomfortable with the idea of arming Black men. It was not until the Second Confiscation Act and the Militia Act of 1862 that President Lincoln permitted African American Union soldiers. After that, there were all Black units that developed, all of which were led by white generals. Although Blacks were now allowed to fight along with the white Union soldiers, they were paid less, given poorer equipment, and lower food rations. Although the government did claim equality in the Union Army for both Blacks and whites, it was clear that Black soldiers were not treated the same. They were given menial tasks such as digging trenches. They were not allotted the same medical treatment, nor were they allowed promotions within their own ranks. Officers were always white men, never Black men. Regardless of their mistreatment in the Union Army, African American men continued to support the Union cause. As the Union armies marched south, many African American slaves used the distraction of the war to escape their Confederate slaveholders in pursuit of freedom. They would follow behind the lines of the Union armies along the countryside. The Union leaders used the escaped slaves as scouts and lookouts to spy on the Confederacy. When they were able, many of the men enlisted in the Union Army, choosing to fight against their old masters. By the end of the Civil War, about 10% of the Union armies were African American, which is roughly 180,000 men. Now let's take a look at the Confederate Army. The Battle of Fort Sumter not only ignited African Americans to fight for the Union, but some also chose to fight for the Confederacy, although in smaller numbers. The Confederate President Davis refused to allow African Americans to bear arms during the start of the war, much like the Union. However, a vast number of enslaved men and women, along with some freed Black men, participated in the Confederate war front. They were responsible for cooking, digging trenches, building camps, washing clothes, and any other needed tasks. A few individuals were also personal servants for Confederate officers. Although not allowed to carry weapons at this time, these African Americans played an integral part in the survival of the Confederacy. Free African Americans who volunteered their services were paid by the Confederacy equal amounts to their white counterparts during the war, and this is unlike in the Union Army. As the war carried on and the Confederates were steadily losing numbers, General Robert E. Lee wrote in a letter expressing the Confederacy's dire need of Black soldiers within their ranks. General Lee's thoughts reached President Davis, and in the winter of 1864, he was persuaded into allowing enslaved African Americans to fight alongside the Confederate soldiers. However, he did not sanction free Blacks carrying arms. Davis was under a strong impression that African Americans must understand their position as slaves, and allowing free Blacks to carry guns and act as white soldiers on the battlefield went against his racial theories. Thus, free African Americans were never sanctioned guns. However, they were paid to participate in other duties for the Confederate Army, as I previously mentioned. Janice Sumner Edmond wrote a book titled The Secret Trust of Aspasia Cruvelier Marriott. Sorry if I mispronounced that. The book details free women of color during the antebellum South. Chapter 4 of her book is called Black Confederates, in which she discussed an African American man by the name of Robert Oliver, who earned a living in the South as a brick mason and was a musician for fun. Robert Oliver was a free African American who volunteered for service in the Confederate Army, where he became a bandsman in the 25th Georgia Regiment. She specifically mentioned Robert Oliver enlisting in the Confederate Army, although his reasoning for such actions can only be speculated, as his thoughts were never documented. Another author, Sam Smith, wrote an article, Black Confederates, Truth and Legend, in which he argues the illegitimacy of Black Confederate soldiers. He clearly states that there was never such a thing as a Black Confederate soldier. He argues that the official record only documents 7 eyewitness accounts of Union soldiers encountering Black Confederates. 4 of these reports claimed they were armed, and 3 said they were unarmed Black laborers. Of the 4 armed reports, 3 stated the Black Confederate soldiers were shooting at the Union soldiers, and the other armed account claimed they imprisoned a group of armed Black and white Confederate soldiers. Smith states, however, that there is no record of an all-Black Confederate unit. I'm about to show you an image from the Civil War with a white Confederate next to a Black Confederate, both men in uniform bearing arms. This picture was taken in 1861. It shows Sergeant Andrew Chandler of the 44th Mississippi Infantry Regiment sitting beside Silas Chandler, a family slave. Both are in uniform, clutching pistols, knives, and a shotgun. There is currently debate as to the truth behind Black Confederate soldiers. Is the Black Confederate soldier a truth or a myth? As I've already stated, there are historians that discuss African Americans enlisting in the Confederate Army, and there are some that deny African Americans were part of the Confederate Army. As a class, I would like for us to discuss the truth versus myth debate. The first thing I believe we should discuss is what classifies someone as a Confederate soldier. Clearly, there are accounts of Black men in Confederate uniform, as the picture I showed demonstrates. There is also documentation of African American slaves fighting with their masters in battle. The Union soldiers were all free men, and their existence is not in question. Does a man have to be free to be considered a Confederate soldier? What about the freedmen, such as Robert Oliver, who clearly volunteered services to the Confederacy? Are they only soldiers if they bear arms? Or does participating in other duties necessary for military survival or battle justify being called a Confederate soldier? I imagine on a basic level, many of us question the motives behind why a Black man would volunteer services to the Confederate Army. If the Confederacy represents Southern culture and slavery, then why would a free Black man support their cause? Does he support slavery? Robert Oliver's mother had been a slaveholder, as were many of the older generations of his family. However, as I previously mentioned, Janice Sumner Edmond was unable to find documentation on his exact motives. Another aspect we might consider is the state of the South during the war. The majority of the battles took place on Southern soil, and there was much devastation for local Southern families regardless of their support for either side. Many homes, jobs, towns were destroyed, and a vast majority of African Americans lived in the South. Their homes and families were in danger, and that alone could give them motive to fight for the Confederacy that was fighting to preserve the South, their home. Retaliation from the Confederacy, should they win the war, is another issue. Remember, no one knows the outcome of the war that we know now. If the South won the Civil War, how would they treat African Americans who fought against them? How would they treat those that assisted them? When captured during the battle, Black Union soldiers were killed on sight by Confederates simply out of principle. Joining the Confederacy might have been a survival mode. Does that legitimize them as Confederate soldiers? Another aspect to discuss is why historians argue the point of non-existence. when clearly African Americans volunteered service to the Confederate Army. We can establish a reasonable motive for joining. We have evidence of them in uniforms. Slaves were allowed to bear arms, and freed African Americans were paid equally for their services. Regardless of their title, African Americans played an integral role in the Confederate war effort. Racial equality and prejudice is still an issue today across our country. What might we gain in denying the existence of Black Confederate soldiers? Does this help to deny the Black community on the war front of race? Does this help to unify the Black community on the war front of race? Or does the idea of a free Black man fighting for the Southern cause hinder their unity? Did Black Confederate soldiers exist? And if they did, do we have a right to hide them from history? Thank you.